This is Ethics Lecture 3 on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Alright, this is our first lecture on Aristotle's Ethics, and when in class I usually like to begin this lecture by asking, why are you here? But that's obviously under the assumption that everyone's in usually room 239 in Fayard Hall. But now you're probably sitting at home with your laptop open and watching this narrated PowerPoint on Aristotle. So let's say someone were to come into your room, and why are you there? Why are you doing what you're doing? Very simple, natural question. Now, if you were to answer, well, I'm doing this for fun, people would probably think you're weird because you don't sit watching narrated presentations on Aristotle for fun. Or maybe you do. Maybe you're one of those rare breeds who does such things. I was one of those rare breeds. I guess that's how I ended up being a philosophy professor. But you probably are not. But even if you were sitting there doing this for fun, that would be a reason for doing it. But more precisely, the reason you are there doing it is because you are doing it in order to, or as a means to, passing an online class. There's a goal or a reason or a purpose for why you are doing this. And as Aristotle goes on in the very first line of the reading, Aristotle says that every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit, is thought to aim at some good. So everything that we do, everything we look into, everything we talk about, etc., is aimed at some purpose or goal which we take to be good. Now, we may be mistaken, and this is precisely what the theme of the Nicomachean Ethics is. Some people may think that going out, getting drunk every night is good. Or, and this is one of the things we'll also talk about, they may know it's not good to do, and yet do it anyways. And so one of the questions that Aristotle is going to look into is, what accounts for our actions? Why do we do the things that we do? And but his starting point, at least, is that as human beings, we all share in one particular goal. In other words, Aristotle firmly believes that if we were to go up to any person, let's say we're to go up to someone at a bus stop and say, why are you at the bus stop? So, well, I'm waiting to catch the bus, they might say. Well, why are you waiting to catch the bus? Well, I'm going off to work. Why are you going to work? Well, I need to make money. Well, why do you need to make money? Well, I need to be able to pay the bills and feed my children. Why do you need to do that? Because that's what makes me happy. Why do you need to be happy? At that point, there is no reason to explain why one wants to be happy. The best that one could give, I suppose, is it's better than being sad. But that's not a reason. In other words, happiness isn't a means to not being sad. Happiness is its own reward. So this leads Aristotle then to come to the conclusion that every person, whoever as a human being, they all desire their ultimate end or goal is happiness. So whoever I would come up to, whoever I would ask, to the extent that they are capable of answering a question, and this is an important criteria in itself, to the extent that they are capable of answering the question, would answer by saying happiness is their ultimate goal in life. Now, the word that Aristotle uses for this in the reading is self-sufficing, meaning in want of nothing. As he goes on to say, happiness isn't one thing that one could add to it and make it more. In other words, I couldn't come along and say, I'm happy, but I would be happier if I had a Mercedes. I wouldn't really be happy because, according to Aristotle, happiness is a state of self-sufficiency, meaning you are in want or dependent or in need of nothing else. So the opposite of self-sufficiency then would be dependency, right? You're a dependent rather than self-sufficient. And so dependent means that you are dependent on someone or something else for your well-being or your good state. And that's a precarious situation to be in because you take that something else away and then suddenly you are no longer happy or in a good state. But that's not happiness. Happiness is a state of self-sufficiency. So once one is happy, then there's no need for anything else to be attained. Now, this does not mean that one shouldn't go out and strive to uh, get a Mercedes if that's what they want. In other words, being happy and striving to attain other goals in life are perfectly uh, uh, possible to be reconciled with one another. You can do both at the same time. But one could not go out, according to Aristotle, and say that I would be happier, though, if I got the Mercedes. Basically, one could be happy while pursuing the other things in life. It's an important point. This is why Aristotle will also use the term that happiness is an end in itself. So if you think about, kind of sketch this out on paper or something like this, and think about your being in front of your computer right now as a means to an end, the end being passing Philosophy 313. Okay. But passing Philosophy 313, although it's an end or goal of sitting and listening to me right now, it's not an end in itself. Why? Well, because it is in turn a means to another end. So passing Philosophy 313 is a means to getting all the credits you need to graduate from college. So getting a college degree. Well, getting a college degree is not an end in itself. In other words, it's not an ultimate self-sufficient end. Ultimately, you are wanting a college degree as a means to another end. In this case, a good or better job than you could get without a college degree. But is that an end in itself? According to Aristotle, no. And this is for Aristotle. All the ends that we pursue in life are generally a means to some other end, with the exception of happiness. It's the one thing we want for its own sake. And that's why he calls it an end in itself, or something that is self-sufficing or self-sufficient. So this is basically the starting point for Aristotle's ethics. And to the extent that this makes sense, then that's good. But one thing to keep in mind, though, is that we aren't all happy. And many people pursue many things that they think will make them happy, but don't. For example, some might think that just becoming wealthy and rich will make them happy. Or some people might think that if they just get into a relationship, they will be happy. Or if they get a good job, they will be happy. And they may discover that when they are in these jobs, they aren't happy. Or things aren't going right. And so for Aristotle, the question then is, how does one realize or attain one's ends or goals? So for example, simply watching this presentation that I'm giving right now doesn't guarantee passing this class. You may blow off the rest of the presentations. You may not do any of the rest of the activities. You may do poorly on the exams, etc., etc. The same is true for every means to an end. The end doesn't happen automatically. So what happens then, if we kind of think of a means and an end and a kind of line or an arrow in between, so the means becomes or is going towards the end, some action or activity is going on in between. In other words, something needs to be done in order to get from being in a class to passing the class. So for example, if you first day of class, you get the syllabus, and one of the first things you look at on the syllabus is, all right, what do I need to do in order to pass this class? How many tests are there? Are there any papers? How much reading is there? Etc., etc. So basically you are trying to figure out all the functions or activities that you need to do in order to pass the class. So now we can kind of begin to hone in on what precisely is happiness for Aristotle. And the key part of the reading, as Aristotle focuses in on happiness, is the function or activity of being human. In other words, as he says in the reading, part of what makes a pianist a good pianist is that they perform a certain function or activity that is unique to pianists, right? If I were to tell you I'm a pianist and then were to play right now without you seeing me some very excellent piano music, you would not necessarily come to the conclusion that I am a pianist, even though that music was clearly performed by a pianist. You have no evidence that it was me performing it. So in other words, you would have to see me performing the function or the activity that is unique to a pianist in order for you to say that, yes, I am a pianist. And same with a flute player or a doctor or various other roles that we identify as having a kind of a unique uh, role to play. There's a certain activity or function that needs to be performed that identifies that role as such. For Aristotle, the role of a doctor is to diagnose and illnesses and prescribe cures. To the extent that a doctor does that activity or performs that function, they are considered a doctor. And to the extent that they perform that function or activity well, then they are considered a good doctor. To the extent that you perform that activity poorly, you are a bad doctor. So the question then is there a function to being human, much as there is a function to being a flute player? And for Aristotle, as he goes on in the reading, he says that there is a function to being human. He goes through three distinct functions. First, there is what we could call the nutritive function. That is the function of life and growth. That's clearly a function that we as human beings perform. As a living being, we have to go eat and grow and consume foods, etc., and perform the nutritive functions of the body in order to stay alive. Well, as Aristotle goes on to say, that's not a function that is uniquely human. In other words, that's not what makes us human. It's like saying, what makes me a pianist? Well, the fact that I had breakfast. I mean, the fact that I had breakfast is not what would make one a pianist, even though a pianist may very well have had breakfast and certainly will have had to eat and carry out the nutritive functions and so on and so forth. Those functions are not what make them a pianist. It is what the function that makes them a living being, but that's obviously something, as Aristotle goes on to say, that we share with animals and plants. Plants perform these functions as well. So that's not our unique human function. So he then goes on and proposes the second one about our sensitive function, our ability to perceive the world and feel pleasures and pains in relationship to the world. Well, clearly that's another function that we perform, but it's also not a function that's unique to humans. As Aristotle goes on to say, it's a function performed or shared by horses and dogs and oxen. They also experience pleasure and pain and perceive the world around them. So he's looking for the function that's unique to human beings. And he comes then to the third and final one, which he does claim is unique to being human, and that is our rational function. As he goes on to say, it's our rational function is both exercising and obeying reason. Okay, this is important. Now, exercising reason means we are able to use reason to figure out what's right and wrong, to grasp rules, to grasp the consequences of rules and actions, and so on and so forth. Okay. So it's being able to recognize that a certain course of conduct is right or wrong, and why it's right or wrong. So that's exercising reason. But it's also necessary for us to obey reason. As we can see, being able to know what is right or wrong isn't necessarily sufficient because one isn't necessarily going to obey what reason tells them to do. It's kind of like, if you'll recall the lecture on Plato's Republic, we can have the rational part of the soul telling us what we should do, but that doesn't mean that we are going to do what it tells us to do. So we need to obey those, or those rules need to be enforced in order for it to be meaningful. So it's much the same thing that Aristotle is saying here. But this, to the extent that we're capable of exercising and obeying reason, or making decisions, is precisely what Aristotle thinks is distinctly human. And one way to think about this ability to exercise reason is to think about it as making decisions, whereas an animal, for example, may respond either instinctually or by learned association to stimuli or scenarios in its environment. Human beings, although we do that too, we are also capable of exercising thought regarding various scenarios and making decisions based upon this thought alone. That's the rational activity. It's being able to think about scenarios that might not even be present, and in fact often are not. And so it's that ability to kind of make a decision and act on the basis of a decision rather than merely as a response to stimulus or something in one's environment. That is what makes us uniquely human. So if that's what makes us human, then what makes human a good human, or what makes a human life a good human life? And this is another point to stress regarding the ancient Greek view of ethics. Their main concern was not so much with what is the right thing to do as what is the good human life. In other words, to live life well is their primary concern. And now we've seen that just as what makes a flute player is their ability to perform a certain function that's unique to flute players and to perform that function well. So what makes a human life a good human life is going to be to perform the function of reasoning well. Well, what does that look like? Well, the short answer to that question is that it's the golden mean. As Aristotle goes on to say, there is the ability to do everything either in excess or in deficiency. We can either do too much or too little. It's like an artist. When they make decisions relative to their work, they can either put too much of something in or not enough. And the goal is to get it just right. Another example would be if I'm a trainer and I have someone coming in and I'm going to give them an exercise routine. I need to know a lot about them. I need to know their basic health, their level of fitness, and a number of things about them, because if I'm not aware of all these things about them, I may make the wrong decision. In other words, I might make them do too much, cause injury or worse, or I may not do enough if they have a level of fitness that would be need more demanding exercise in order to get the level of fitness they want, then I would need to give them more. But it's going to vary from person to person what this exercise routine is going to be. And so for Aristotle, then, part of making the right decision or exercising reason well is that one does make the right decision in each and every one of their actions. And making that right decision is hitting what he calls the mean or virtue. And you can go wrong in two ways, basically, either in excess or deficiency. And that's what brings me to this chart that I have here on this slide. And you can see a number of the virtues in the middle: courage, temperance, liberality, magnificence, and so on, and the various vices on both sides. So for example, when one does something courageous, one is doing something that entails some risk or danger. And in the face of risk or danger, one is going to naturally feel some fear. But one also needs, if one's going to do something courageous, to have some confidence in the face of this fear that they can do it. If one has an excess of confidence, then they might do something rash. They might do something stupid, really. They might get themselves hurt, or because they lack the awareness of the difficulty involved. So they're confident in a circumstance where they should not be. If they're lacking in confidence and have too, and I suppose you could also say excessive in fear, then the result is cowardice. We also, with respect to pleasures, right? Temperance is being moderate with respect to pleasures. As Aristotle will say, wine is good, but just because wine is good doesn't mean one should have 2 bottles of wine every night. But similarly, not pursuing any of the pleasures of life at all is a vice too. And you'll notice it has in parentheses rare, and as Aristotle goes on to say, it's highly uncommon. And that's, as we'll see a little bit later, because our natural tendency is to pursue pleasure, so it's very rare for us to not pursue pleasure. If anything, our natural tendency is to pursue it in excess. So you can go down this list and do kind of maybe pause the video at this point and maybe think of these different virtues and go on and imagine how they would look and how you might write about them, and an actual example that you might think of that fits the virtue, and examples that would be examples of the vices. And then when you come back and start it again, I'll talk about the last example, proper indignation or righteous indignation. Okay, I hope you have studied and thought through some of those lists of virtues and written them down and thought of some examples. That will be something that will be on the test. So the last thing I want to talk about in this particular lecture, and then on the next lecture we will pick up from here, is to kind of sum up where we are now with respect to virtue. Now, as Aristotle will say, virtue is going to be the right action in the right circumstance and in the right way towards the right person, and so on. And the key here for Aristotle is that it be right. If you'll recall from the previous slide in the list of virtues, the right is often a balance between excess and deficiency, but sometimes it's just simply a matter of getting it right. So the case of righteous indignation, or proper indignation, as the last one was listed on the previous slide, it's between envy and spite. Now, if we think about righteous indignation, it's either being angered at someone's good fortune or pleased at someone's bad fortune. Okay. Now, on the one hand, it might seem that it's never appropriate to be angered at someone's good fortune, but for Aristotle, it is if that good fortune is undeserved. If someone cheated or slept with the boss or did various other things that we see leads them to be undeserving of the good fortune that they ended up getting, then we are right to be angered or indignant at their good fortune. So the pain at good fortune that's deserved, however, that would be envy. Okay, so you see the difference then? The difference between righteous indignation and envy is simply a difference between whether the good fortune is deserved or not. And the same is true for spite and righteous indignation. On the one hand, it might seem that being pleased at someone's misfortune is never a good thing. I mean, someone comes and says, "Oh, my house burnt down," and that makes me feel good. That wouldn't be very proper, I would say. I'm sure you would agree. But is it ever appropriate to feel pleasure at someone else's misfortune? For Aristotle, yes, when that misfortune is deserved. If they have committed a crime and have been sentenced for that crime, and it's a sentence you think is deserved, then you can feel pleased that justice has been served. And so, yes, there are circumstances where being pleased at someone's misfortune is justified. And that's righteous indignation. That's a case when their misfortune is deserved. Whereas spite is when one gets a pleasure out of someone's undeserved misfortune. So that's why when the key here between the last slide and all those examples of virtue and this example of righteous indignation, the key is that it be the right action in the right circumstance and in the right way. And that's not always going to be the same for every person or every circumstance. And it's going to be something that one needs to decide upon in that circumstance. And when one decides and decides well and correctly, then that is when one's using one's rational faculty or function well. And that's precisely what it means to be living well, or to be living in accordance with virtue. So the last point for this particular lecture then is this distinction between moral and intellectual virtue, which ties in with the distinction that I discussed earlier between exercising and obeying reason. Intellectual virtue is going to be the capacity to exercise reason to know right from wrong. It's the ability to be able to read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, understand what he's talking about, to be able to think about the consequences of actions, and so on and so forth. Now, generally, children lack intellectual virtue, which is why we treat them by a different moral standard. Juveniles who commit a crime aren't treated by the same weight of the law as adults. And the general theory behind this, of course, is that they are assumed to not fully understand the consequences of their actions. Now, there obviously are some gray areas. A 14-year-old who commits a heinous crime may be tried as an adult. But a 4-year-old or 5-year-old who gets a gun and shoots someone, accidentally and kills them, they will not be tried or face any consequences. Whereas the parent who left a gun out may very well be charged with a crime because they should have known better. And it's that key term, should know, having known better. That's where the intellectual virtue comes in. Moral virtue, on the other hand, is the capacity or tendency to obey reason or to do what is right. And this is going to be more a matter of habit. It's going to be character. And this is something that is acquired through repetition, through experience, through education, through upbringing. And this is something that children may have. They may have had a very good upbringing and have been well raised and have very good, proper habits, even though they don't necessarily understand or have the intellectual virtue yet to know why what they're doing is the right thing. And so for Aristotle, then, to be truly and fully moral entails having both moral and intellectual virtue. In the next lecture, we'll talk about some of the implications of this.